Hello and welcome once again to Ourdadsstamps video for the first video of 2024, and a happy new year to everybody. For today's video I thought I would look at the stamps of South Africa. Now there's quite a lot involved in South African stamps, especially if you consider the colonies before the formation of South Africa. So I'm going to start from the date the Union of South Africa came into being, which was in 31st of May 1910. The Union was made up of 4 previously separated colonies, namely Cape Colony, Natal, Transvaal and the Orange River Colony, all of which produced their own stamps at one point. To look at these stamps I think would take a whole separate video, and maybe one that I look at later. It's interesting though that the stamps of the 4 colonies were valid throughout the use of South Africa up until 1932. Undoubtedly the intention was to produce stamps on the first day of the Union to commemorate that event, but unfortunately the death of King Edward VII a couple of weeks before meant that preparations of a die showing the portrait of King George V weren't possible. And so it wasn't until later in the year, the 4th of November, that the first stamp of the Union of South Africa was produced. And this was a single 2.5p stamp commemorating the opening of the first Union Parliament. The first complete set of definitive stamps was issued in 1913, which featured the head of King George V and comprised of 15 stamps from a halfpenny up until a £1 stamp. Apart from the high values, these stamps are quite easy to get hold of and not particularly valuable. Even the 10 shilling one used is only catalogued at about £12, so in used format it's quite easy to collect this whole set, and indeed in mint it's not too difficult up to the 5 shilling value, and as a complete set it does look quite nice, so it's definitely one worth looking at. Unusually for the time as well, they also produced some coil stamps for the halfpenny, penny and penny halfpenny. These are more valuable, but again not extortionately valuable, so it's worth looking out for. And you can tell that they're coil stamps because they're imperforated down the sides. In 1926 they issued a triangular stamp which was based on the Cape of Good Hope triangles. And these stamps are always exciting to look at and ones that I think are very important. And obviously the Cape of Good Hope stamps are very, very valuable. Unfortunately, the South African triangular stamps are not particularly valuable at all. They were printed in English and in Afrikaans, and both stamps are valued of the same amount. You can pick these up for a few pence, mint or used, so whilst they look nice and look exciting because they're triangles, they're not valuable by any means. With the odd exception from 1926, all South African stamps were printed bilingually in pairs. So you had one stamp that was in English and the stamp next to it was in Afrikaans. If you're collecting these stamps, you really need to collect them in pairs, horizontal pairs, so that you've got both stamps. Singularly they are worth very little, and you can pick up hundreds of the individual stamps for next to nothing, but it's only when they're in pairs, whether used or unused, that they have any real value. The first sets that were produced run from a halfpenny up to 5 shillings, and these can be a very confusing sets because they were actually printed 4 different times, and each print is slightly different. To be able to tell the basic difference between the first 2 sets and the second 2 sets is on the Afrikaans stamp, which on the first 2 is all in one word, Suid-Afrika, and in the second 2 sets it's a hyphenated word. So this is one of the reasons why it makes more sense to buy them in pairs, because it's a lot more difficult to tell the difference between other stamps when you've only got the English one. As I said, the first set was printed in 1926-27, and Suid-Afrika is all in one word. In 1930, the same stamps were redrawn and printed again, and the differences between the stamps is quite easy to detect, and there are some good descriptions in the Stanley Gibbons catalogue. It takes a bit of effort and it takes a bit of time, but you can tell the difference between the two sets, and it can make quite a significant difference between the value of the two, so it's worth spending a bit of time to see which one you've actually got. For the latter two sets, one printed in 1933 and the other in 1947, the Swedefrika is hyphenated. These were printed by rotogravure method. However, the second set was screened rotogravure, and there is again a distinct difference between the two. Once again, it's quite well documented in the Stanley Gibbons catalogue, although slightly more difficult to distinguish. And once again, it does make quite a difference in the value of these. So, as I said before, it's worth spending a bit of time and actually separating these out into sets. But to be honest, it's only worth spending that time if you've got them in the pairs, because if you've got the singles, as I've already said, there really isn't a lot of value in the single stamp. I personally don't waste my time. If I've only got singles, then I don't bother trying to categorise them. But when they're in pairs, then certainly it's worth having a look at and worth spending time over. In between releasing all these sets, South Africa produced a commemorative for the King George V Silver Jubilee, which was totally different from the ones produced by the rest of the Commonwealth. And again, they were in two languages, and you need to collect the pairs rather than singles to get any value from them. They also did the same with King George VI coronation, and once again in pairs. You need to collect them in pairs to get any value. The coronation set is interesting as well because there's actually two different types of watermark. Whilst there really isn't any difference in the value between the watermarks, it's interesting to collect both. And it's simply the way the paper was put in the sheets. The watermark is of a Springbok's head, and on one set of stamps you've got the watermark with the horns pointing to the left of the stamp, and in the other set you've got the horns pointing to the right of the stamp. It's quite easy to tell the difference when looking at watermarks, so if you really want to collect the whole lot of South African stamps, then you know there's two sets of the King George VI coronation there to collect. After King George VI's coronation, South Africa didn't print any definitives with the King's head on them. They did, however, produce a couple of sets to commemorate the Ourdadsstamps Centenary Memorial Fund. Again, these were in two languages, and you need to collect them in pairs, but those sets are quite valuable, especially the first one that came out. If you've got the mint pairs of the whole set, it's catalogued at about £80, so not completely out of reach, but certainly not cheap. They also produced one on the anniversary of the Huguenots landing. I think I've pronounced that right. And again, the whole set in mint pairs is quite valuable and worth looking for if you can pick them up. In 1941, like a lot of countries at the time, they produced a set of stamps to aid the war effort. And again, these are in two languages and need to be collected in pairs. They run from a halfpenny up to a 1 and 3 stamp and feature different images from the war. Unusually, there were two stamps printed bilingually, so whilst you need a pair of stamps for most of them, the twopenny and the 1 shilling stamp can be collected singly. However, in my view, it looks a bit odd if you've got a set of 7 stamps in pairs and then 2 other stamps as singles, so I like to collect the whole set in pairs. It's a reasonably valuable set, not hugely so. However, the one that does stand out is the threepenny blue, which mint is catalogued at £20 and used is catalogued at £50. But I guess it's difficult to get hold of a used pair because most people would have only stuck one of the stamps on for postage. This set was repeated in 1942, but half size or even less than half size, known in South Africa as the bantams because of their small size. They were produced in order to save paper and therefore save money to help towards the war. They are identical designs with a couple of extra values in there, and in some cases they're actually collectible in groups of 3 rather than 2. And the perforation between the 3 stamps is roulette, but around the outside of the 3 is at normal perforation. So it's quite an interesting configuration, and the ones to look out for are the halfpenny, the penny, the threepence and the fourpence, which were all produced in triplets. The complete set of 8 stamps in the triples or pairs is catalogued at £50. So again, a good set to have, not completely out of reach, but not cheap either. And it's quite interesting to collect tiny stamps. I do find it difficult to mount these stamps or to find mounts to put them in, but they're interesting stamps, and interesting if you collect the full-size one as well as the smaller versions. After the war, South Africa started to produce the stamps bilingually, so you have both languages on each individual stamp. They produced a single stamp for Queen Elizabeth coronation in 1953. Again, this was a different design from the rest of the Commonwealth and is not particularly valuable, but it's one to get if you're collecting the omnibus edition of coronation stamps. The next definitive set came out in 1954, which was a set depicting the animals of South Africa. And this is quite a nice set, especially for the thematic collector, because the whole set of 14 stamps shows different animals. It's not a particularly valuable set. All 14 stamps mint is catalogued at £35 and used at £6, so you can pick up the used ones very, very easily. But again, like a lot of South African stamps, you need to look out. There are variations, and some of these were reprinted in 1959 with a different watermark. The original set had the Springbok's head watermark, but the ones that were reprinted in 1959 had the coat of arms from the Union on the back. And these are worth more or less the same. They're not particularly valuable. The only one that is unusual is the 5 shilling used is a lot more, almost 10 times as much as the 5 shilling with the Springbok's head on. So something worth checking for, looking out for the watermarks. And the difference between these two watermarks is quite significant, so it's not that difficult to tell apart. In 1961, South Africa changed currency to cents and the rand, and most of the 1954 animal sets, plus a few other individual stamps from the interim period, were reprinted in decimal currency. And then later that same year, South Africa became a republic and so produced a further definitive set of stamps to mark the beginning of the republic. Now you'd think with the new currency set was only around for a few months, to be honest, that they would be worth a lot of money, but in actual fact they're not. And I assume that was because they continued to be valid for a long time after, even though the country had changed to a republic. The new republic definitive set is a whole new set of designs, and it runs from ½ cent up to R1. And once again with this set, there are several different printings with several different watermarks. So there's a whole range of different stamps to collect if you want to get the complete series. These are a little bit more difficult to tell apart, mainly because the watermark is harder to detect in some cases. The first set was printed on paper with the Union coat of arms watermark, which seems a bit of a contradiction since they were celebrating being a republic but still had the Union symbol on the back of the stamps. However, later in 1961, most of those were reprinted without any watermark, And then in 1963, they were printed again with the Republic of South Africa watermark, which is the letters RSA in a triangle. A further set of these stamps with a few additional values was reprinted again in 1964, but these had been slightly redrawn, and it is fairly easy to tell the difference between the two, particularly in the inscriptions. The typeface on the words is quite different. And finally in 1969, this set was reissued once again, this time with phosphor bands printed horizontally and vertically between the stamps. In the right light conditions, that makes it look as though there's a frame all the way around the stamp. So with this set alone, there is a lot to look for and a lot to collect. Values on all sets are quite reasonable, and most of the stamps can be picked up fairly cheaply. There's a few variations of the R1, which is slightly more expensive, but as I said, most of the others are quite easily affordable, and if you want to go the full hog, then there's now 5 different varieties of the same set to collect. In 1963, there was a single stamp printed which had Transkei written along the bottom of the stamp, and this was the first stamp of a group of stamps that came out in the 70s for the black homelands that were set up. Now, although these homelands weren't recognised internationally, their stamps were recognised. So if South Africa is something you really want to collect, then you can also include the stamps from Transkei, Ciskei, Venda and Bophuthatswana, which issued stamps from the 70s to 1994 when they were integrated back into South Africa. Like almost every country in the world, the 1980s, 90s and thereafter saw South Africa produce a plethora of stamps. In amongst this, there are some very nice sets to collect, and naturally for South Africa, the flora and fauna of South Africa feature highly in these. I particularly like a set of succulents, which is quite an unusual subject matter, that came out in the late 70s. There's a set of architecture, which again is quite an unusual subject matter, from the 80s. Several more flora and fauna sets, and quite a nice set in 1990 of aviation, which can actually be bought as a complete mini sheet, or complete sheet if you like, with all the different stamps on them. There is a huge amount of stamps to collect from 1970 onwards, but some of them can be quite interesting and can be quite attractive. So plenty of there to keep your interest, plenty for the thematic collector, and plenty things to get your teeth into. Well, I hope you enjoyed that brief introduction to South African stamps. The former colonies of South Africa would take up a whole video in itself, and maybe something I look at later, although I am very short of content for those colonies. Anyway, thank you for watching, and hope to see you again in a few weeks' time. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget you can visit my online stores at eBay and Delcamp under the name of Ourdadsstamps, where I have over 2,000 items for sale. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Ourdadsstamps podcast.